It's my pleasure to present Christine LaFollette, who will introduce tonight's guest. Christine LaFollette is the partner in charge of Aiken Gump Strauss Howard Feld's Houston's office. And with more than 30 years of experience in public offerings, private placements of equity and debt securities, restructurings, financings, and federal state securities laws matters, and a long-standing board member of the Council and Executive Committee Vice President of the World Affairs Council. Christine, welcome to our program tonight. We're so glad you've joined us.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for what I know is going to be a very informative program. Our mission at the Council is to listen and learn in order to gain a better understanding of our world, its people, its politics, so that we can work together and find the best solutions to the problem. So we are very thrilled to have with us tonight Jake Sullivan. Jake is an American policymaker and a foreign policy expert whose career is just filled with many honors and prestigious assignments. He holds an undergraduate and a law degree from Yale University, and as a Rhodes Scholar, he has a master's from Oxford. Jake served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. He was involved in the negotiations of many things, including what led to the Iran nuclear agreement. He also worked with Hillary Clinton as her top aide when she was Secretary of State and traveled with her to over 100 countries. She describes him as a cool-headed, clear-eyed analyst of the problems we face with our national security. And he also served with her as her foreign policy advisor in the 2016 election. So while I could go on and on about his career, I'm anxious for us to get to the conversation. And so without further delay, I will turn this over to our colleague, Ronan O'Malley, who always does a great job, and our special guest, Jake Sullivan. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Christine LaFollette, and especially thank you very much to Aiken Gump, who a longtime wonderful supporter of the Council for many, many years. And thank you, Marianne, again for joining us and introductions. And welcome to all of our members, guests, and especially our students and teachers. Delighted to have all of you here today. And thank you so much to Jake Sullivan for joining us. Jake was meant to join us earlier in the year, like a lot of our events that had to be canceled and postponed for our in-person events. You kindly have joined us now online, and we hope at some point to have you again back in Houston in person. But as Christine mentioned, you have a long and impressive career, especially within the Obama administration. Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, Deputy Chief of Staff to at the time U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Maybe just so people understand, we are going to be discussing issues related to the election, and just so everyone knows. But you'll be talking more about perhaps the outcomes that maybe are important to the United States, policy issues, how they might be major factors in the election, maybe perhaps more importantly, whatever the results might be, how U.S. policy may or may not change, say, come January. But I do want to make it clear for our audience that this evening, we're delighted to host Jake, but we're hosting him tonight in a personal capacity. He is not here as a representative of the Biden campaign or as of Joe Biden. So any positions he gives this evening are merely his personal perspectives and reflective of his deep and intimate knowledge of American foreign policy. They are not positions or platforms of the campaign. Is that fair to say, Jake?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've covered it. There's so much to talk about. We'll get to as much as we can. But perhaps maybe just to start with the two nations that for a long time, and especially even more so in recent years, have been major issues in American foreign policy with regards to obviously large nuclear powered nations, but incredible, especially with regards to China, economic aspects around the world and military aspects, as well as the Russians throughout their region and perhaps into the Middle East. Maybe we'll just start with Russia and China, and then we'll move the conversation on from there. Russia is obviously a very complicated position. It's been complicated for both Democratic and Republican presidents. Bush, obviously, Bush 43, famously said, I looked into Putin's eyes and I felt I had a sense of his soul. Obama himself, early on in the administration, there was the idea of the reset. And I think as you've noted before, the idea of a reset was not first created by Hillary Clinton, was first actually issued publicly by Vice President Biden. Could you talk about what that actually means? And perhaps when it comes to Russia, are the challenges, I mean, a lot of it is obviously specific with dealing with Putin himself, but also more broadly, the challenges of dealing with Russia and their perspective towards the US, and maybe how the United States foreign policy has misinterpreted it. And in a bigger way, whether it's Bush or Obama or obviously Trump, it's a complicated relationship. Are reasonable relations possible, or perhaps should we just view Russia in a transactional sense and cooperate on issues, say, just that are of mutual interest, such as arms reduction talks or cooperation on anti-terrorism efforts?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the way you framed it up is fair and balanced. I think I've heard that phrase before, fair and balanced. But let me start with the notion of the reset back in 2009, because I think it's important to establish that as a foundation for us to sort of understand what 2021 would look like if Joe Biden were elected president. So in 2009, the idea behind the reset was not that the United States and Russia were going to become best buddies. It was that there was a reasonable list of items in the foreign policy world that the US and Russia could work on together that would advance the interests of both nations. In fact, there was some real low-hanging fruit. So a New START treaty, which lowered the total number of warheads that the US and Russia had, nuclear warheads, to the lowest level in decades. Sanctions on North Korea and Iran to try to prevent them from advancing their nuclear programs. The ability to transit supplies across Russian territory so that our troops in Afghanistan would be properly equipped. Those are just some of a number of things that in the first couple of years of the Obama-Biden administration, we could work with Russia on and actually produce results. And we did. Now, at the same time, right from the start, Joe Biden and Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton also said, we're going to have to stand up to Russia where our interests diverge. At the time, that was much more focused on Georgia, which had recently been invaded by Russia, and pushing back against Russia's violation of its neighbor's sovereignty. But it also was around issues related to democracy and human rights. Okay, fast forward to 2021. What is the list of items upon which the US and Russia could credibly work together in a constructive way? It's not a null set. There are issues. For one thing, the New START treaty needs to be extended. It expires shortly after Joe Biden would take office in February of 2021. And the Trump administration has made some noises about doing something on that in the next couple of months. That's possible. If not, Vice President Biden has made clear that if he's elected president, he will act to extend that treaty to make sure that we continue to secure a long-term basis upon which we can avert the possibility of nuclear war with Russia. A second is the Iran nuclear deal. We worked very closely. I personally worked very closely with Russian diplomats to help put Iran's nuclear program in a box and to set them back so that they couldn't produce a nuclear weapon. And certainly we could work with Russia once again in a new administration on issues related to Iran's nuclear program. The list is not much longer than that when you start looking at it. And the list of issues upon which we have profound and deep disagreements is getting longer by the year. Let's start with the fact that Russia is currently actively interfering in American democracy. Joe Biden has said he will take measures to hold them accountable for that. That they are trying to weaken and divide the Western alliance, including through military harassment that is quite dangerous. That they are putting bounties on the heads of US soldiers in Afghanistan. That just recently, it didn't really make front page news, a Russian convoy in Syria actually attacked an American convoy and injured US troops in Syria. And fundamentally that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has a strategy that centers around wanting to undermine and weaken American democracy and to destabilize and divide the democratic nations in the transatlantic relationship, the US, Canada, and NATO. And so we are going to have incredibly tense engagement with Russia. And I haven't even talked about Ukraine. But the idea, I think, Ronan, really is for us to find a way to stand up and deal with Russia in a clear-eyed way on all of those issues without it descending into some kind of confrontation or outright military conflict, to find a stable, effective basis upon which to deal with this country and this leader, so that we are actively advancing America's national security interests and protecting and defending our allies at the same time. Sorry to go on for so long, but the big question and
it's good. I know. Yeah, I didn't give you a one sentence answer opportunity. You mentioned Ukraine. Obviously, I think a lot of people would agree with the Obama administration's decision to not become directly involved militarily, despite some people having calls for it, especially with regards to or supplying offensive weapons to the Ukrainian government. But here it is now, basically about almost 6 years later. It's a frozen conflict. From a U.S. perspective, what do you think is the best way to approach Ukraine? Obviously, I think a lot of people would say Ukraine and definitely Georgia. The likelihood or the rationale behind them joining NATO would be probably quite risky. What do you think is a realistic outlook for American policy towards Ukraine?
Well, for starters, I think we need a sense of clarity around the fact that we are going to hold Russia and Putin accountable on the issue of Ukraine. We are going to continue to apply financial and economic pressure through sanctions, which the current administration has really resisted. We're also going to support Ukraine in terms of the development of their own democracy and the strengthening of their own institutions, which, the current occupant of the Oval Office sort of actively undermined by trying to drag Ukraine into American politics in ways that featured quite prominently earlier this year. So there's the element of reinforcing and buttressing Ukraine's democratic institutions and helping them further their anti-corruption agenda. There's the element of financial and economic pressure on Russia. And then there is the element of various forms of material support to Ukraine, to include training, to include other types of assistance that we can provide to them. And I think all of that should move forward in a new administration. I do not believe that direct military action by the United States in Ukraine makes sense, nor do I believe at this time that there's a serious call, even from Kyiv, with respect to issues around NATO membership. And so I think we need to take this in an effective, methodical, consistent, and strong way without tipping over into precipitous acts that could end up doing more harm than good.
And just related to it, maybe before we move on, Belarus is in the news for the last many weeks, massive protests, but they have not reached the level. There has been a large-scale repression, but nowhere near the level of repression that we had, say, at the Maidan in Ukraine. And perhaps, it's difficult to say where things will go from here. For a lot of ways, it seems like from Putin's perspective, the best scenario is kind of a degree of instability or uncertainty for people in his near abroad, whether it be in Georgia or Ukraine, that they basically have to maintain a relationship with Russia and to keep kind of the connections down with the West at a lower level. Is there anything the U.S. could or should be doing in regards to Belarus, or is it, I suppose, in some ways, maybe just too much in Russia's sphere of influence?
Well, the one thing that we can do at a bare minimum, which I would like to hear more from President Trump in this regard, is to speak out clearly in terms of what America's position is here. Vice President Biden put out a very strong statement, which would kind of show you what he would be doing if he were in the Oval Office right now in terms of speaking to America's values on these issues. Here's what we know. We know the presidential election was marred by electoral fraud. We know that citizens who've been peacefully protesting in these sort of amazing and inspiring images that are beaming back to the rest of the world from Minsk and other parts of Belarus are being met by police using stun grenades and tear gas and rubber bullets. We know that the Lukashenko regime has cut internet access, has arrested protesters, now has arrested political leaders. None of these are the actions of a leader who is confident that he won a fairly conducted election. And the United States should speak up in calling for a transparent and accurate vote count, the release of all political prisoners, should call on Lukashenko to respect the rights and refrain from further violence. But frankly, we should be rallying our friends and partners in the region as well to all speak with one voice on this issue. At the end of the day, Putin is going to do what he's going to do, and he seems to have provided aid and comfort to Lukashenko to carry out this repression because he sees it as fundamentally in his interest to do so. But that should not stop the United States or our fellow allies and partners, our fellow democracies in Europe, from speaking out in a clear and unified voice on this issue.
Thank you. And just to move on to China, I think a lot of Americans, whether Republicans or Democrats, would agree that in some ways the United States maybe needs to take some more direct actions with regards to China when it comes to trade or trade imbalances or kind of perhaps what would be, I suppose, unbalanced trade tactics. But maybe people might differ with regards to how policies were carried out. Do you think it would be better for the United States to say establish itself, kind of rejoin the framework for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to say to work with our allies in a coordinated response to trade for the greater Pacific region, or how do you think we should approach the issues of trade differently with China?
So I think we have to start on the question of China by reinforcing our domestic foundation first. I think that is our highest priority, because in order to truly deal with China from a position of strength, we've got to get our own economic, political, and social house in order. At the moment, what you have Xi Jinping doing is going around saying basically to the rest of the world, look at the United States, it's a complete and utter mess. Don't follow that model. Follow our model. Our model works, a model of authoritarian capitalism, of total government control, of repression enabled by technology. If you try this democracy thing, this free market democracy thing, you're going to end up with what you see in the United States right now. So in order for us to effectively be able to compete with China on technology, on economics, and frankly, as the beacon and example for the rest of the world, we have a lot of repair work to do at home. And so that would be my number one priority in terms of, so our foreign policy vis-a-vis China should really be our domestic policy, the major investments we have to make here. Then number two, and this gets to your point about kind of working with other countries around common trade rules and the like, we do have to rally our allies and partners to get on the same page around how we deal with China's trade abuses, whether it's illegal subsidies, or it's the support they provide to state-owned enterprises, or it's industrial scale cyber theft of trade secrets from the United States and other countries. And having a common front of more than half the world's economy, which is not just the nations who have signed on to TPP, but the countries of Europe as well, to come up with a common agenda, a common plan for how we're going to push back against these trade abuses, and also set some new standards on economic issues, on technology issues, on issues related to climate and corruption and taxation. That to me is a high priority. Now, the vice president has said he would not join TPP as currently negotiated. Years have passed. The issues that we are confronting today are somewhat different than they were 5 years ago. And so we need a fresh kind of set of thinking around how we rally our allies effectively. But the notion that we should be working with fellow market economies to deal with China, that's got to be at the core of this. And I would say his biggest criticism of Donald Trump in respect to the approach to China is about going alone. It's about, and even worse than going it alone, kind of starting multi-front wars, picking fights with Canada, of all people, Canada, instead of rallying Canada and Europe and Japan and Australia and other friends and partners to deal with China effectively.
And maybe a last issue with regards to China, that's always a complicated one. For years, people have talked about issues of people in Tibet. Obviously much more recent years, there have been the issues of the Uyghurs, 1 million plus people in re-education camps in Xinjiang province. That re-education camps are the Chinese own terms they use for it. And the crackdown on protesters in Hong Kong. When it comes to human rights violations within China, do you think that is a priority that administration should pursue? Or should we be more concerned about economic issues, more concerned about military development, expansion, South China Sea? Because a lot of people would say when you push back on certain domestic human rights issues in China, they will push back even harder and you're unlikely to get anywhere. That's one place where they will not back down.
I'm really glad you raised that issue because frankly, my previous answer to you was incomplete. I don't think you can have an effective China strategy that is simply focused on the narrow dollars and cents question of economics or on the simple puts and takes of of the security relationship and the military posture of the United States and China in the region. It also has to come down to questions of values. China has reached a point now in terms of its wide-scale repression and atrocities against the Uyghur people in Western China. It has reached a level of repression with respect to the citizens of Hong Kong. Frankly, it's reached a level of technology-enabled repression of its own citizens that it is imperative that American leaders speak out clearly on these issues and take specific actions as well. So, for example, Joe Biden has proposed imposing targeted sanctions on those who are carrying out these various acts of violence and repression. And in addition, placing curbs on American companies from providing the tools and technologies that enable the kinds of restrictive and horrific policies that we've seen. Technology firms who've supplied China, American technology firms who've supplied China with surveillance technology to be able to conduct mass surveillance of Uyghurs. Firms that have provided crowd control equipment and other things like this. The Biden administration would not only put a stop to that in law, but would very strongly enforce it as well. And then with respect to Taiwan specifically, we would have to re-examine fundamental aspects of the relationship, the unique special status that Taiwan has, given that China is taking these measures to go back on its commitment from 1997 and to undermine the agreement that was there to protect the rights and autonomy of the people of Hong Kong well into the future. And so this, yes, has to be a central part of an effective long-term strategy vis-a-vis China. Now, Joe Biden is not looking for a new Cold War. And he thinks that kind of analogy can be quite dangerous. And there are places where we need to be able to work with China on issues related to climate change, to global health, for example. But at the end of the day, we also need to stand up very firmly and compete very aggressively where it is in our interest to do so. And standing firmly on the ground of American values, human rights, democracy, dignity, decency. These are things that should be restored to the core of America's foreign policy writ large, and specifically with respect to China.
All right, and to move on to Iran, something a lot of people may be familiar with you, and if they're not, you, along with just a very small number of senior U.S. officials, including Deputy Secretary of State William Burns, met privately with the Iranian counterparts in Oman for multiple times to negotiate this agreement. I suppose, could you, before we get into what's occurred in recent years, could you talk about what the goals were from this agreement, and perhaps maybe make clear to people, I think if you talk to some of your fellow colleagues from the administration, they would say, given the choice between a nuclear-armed Iran as a terrorist rogue state or a non-nuclear-armed Iran as a terrorist state, we'll take, obviously the option without it. That this was not meant to address, obviously the terrorist actions, whether and military actions, whether it be in Yemen or Hezbollah, and or in Syria. Can you talk about what the goals were for the nuclear deal? And I suppose in some ways, if you felt it was living up to its promises or not.
Sure. It's easy to forget now because it's, every day seems like a year. Like it's hard to remember last week, let alone 2013, 2012. When I made my first trip to the Gulf country of Oman to meet with senior Iranian negotiators, it was the summer of 2012. And it was myself, and this was just before Bill got engaged. It was Bill Burns, it was myself, a representative from the White House, and the two of us met with 4 Iranians who had been dispatched by the Iranian government. At that time, in the summer of 2012, our intelligence community estimated that Iran had a breakout time, meaning if it chose to dash for a nuclear bomb, of 2 to 3 months. So from the moment the Supreme Leader said go, they had enough capabilities at that moment where somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks later, they could have their first nuclear device. So the clock was ticking. This was a pressing issue that we had to resolve. And so our first and paramount priority was to put a stop to their program moving forward, and then to roll it back so that they would not be anywhere close to being able to move to a nuclear bomb. And then to also get the inspectors and verification on the ground so that we had 24/7 access to all of their facilities to know if they were trying to do anything untoward or move their program forward, either overtly or covertly. So that was what this was all about. So we show up in Oman, flew on a commercial flight, incognito, and land at the airport. We stayed in the home of an American diplomat in Oman where they were out of town, so the house was empty. And the bedrooms all ended up being locked. So there's only one open bedroom, as a kid's bedroom. My colleague slept on the kid's bed with his feet dangling off, and I slept on the couch. So this was not exactly the glamorous stuff of movies. We spent 12 hours in intense negotiations and didn't get very far. It took several meetings for us to ultimately break through. When we left for our second meeting, Bill Burns and I met with President Obama and Vice President Biden in the Oval Office. And as we were walking out, President Obama said, "I've just got one presidential instruction for you, which is don't screw it up." And off we went, and ultimately ended up negotiating an agreement that is by no means perfect, was by no means perfect. And this is something that's really important to convey to people who follow diplomacy. Diplomacy, at the end of the day, is the art of imperfection. If you get everything you want and the other side gives up everything it has, that's not diplomacy, that's surrender. Diplomacy is not about getting everything you want, it's about getting everything you need. And that fundamentally is what I think the Iran nuclear deal did. It gave us the assurances that we needed to be able to look the American people in the eye and say, we have stopped Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and we can verify that they cannot do so. Now, it did leave open the possibility that Iran would continue its terrorist activities, its support for rogue regimes across the region, its support for the slaughter of people in Syria. But here's the important thing about the Iran nuclear deal. Nothing in that deal put any limitation on the United States or any of our allies or partners to keep pushing back aggressively against that through all means. We didn't consent to, ratify, say okay to, or otherwise tie our hands on responding to Iran's bad behavior in the region. And in fact, the design of the agreement was such that we retain the capacity for all of those tools going forward. And now, sitting here today, having walked away from the agreement, the Trump administration issued 12 demands to Iran, 12 demands that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo laid out. Iran has complied with 0 of those demands. Iran, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, reported just last week that Iran now has moved its program forward from where it was locked down under the deal to where it now has enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb. Doesn't mean it has a nuclear bomb, but it now has enough fissile material for one. That is the wages of pulling out of a deal that was working with, frankly, at the end of the day, very little to show for it. Now, I'm obviously biased, so, I can't ask you guys just to take my word for it, but I think the facts do speak for themselves. Under the deal, Iran was a year away from having enough material for one weapon. Now, after 2 years of having left the deal, Iran has enough material for a bomb. That's the scoreboard. And that, I think, is the difference between successful diplomacy and, just going for pressure without a plan. And it really worries me about where we are going to end up in terms of our security, Israel's security, the region's security, because Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon today than they were the day that Barack Obama and Joe Biden left office.
And I think maybe just, in line with that, I think it should be noticed that, all the heads of U.S. intelligence agencies testified, correct me if I'm wrong, that Iran was largely adhering to the terms of the agreement before we withdrew unilaterally.
Our intelligence agencies, Israel's intelligence agencies, the International Atomic Energy Agency, everyone was saying they were complying. Basically, Donald Trump thought this was the worst deal in human history. Which, if true, would be kind of impressive because there have been a lot of deals cut in human history. And if I help cut the worst one ever in all of human history, I mean, that's like kind of an extraordinary thing. And they just, Trump didn't like it. A lot of his allies and partners in the US Congress didn't like it. So they walked away. But, my issue on this is not that there are not legitimate arguments about aspects of the deal that, could be strengthened, or that it didn't get everything we wanted. That, of course, that's true of any diplomatic deal. And frankly, those of us who negotiated it should be willing to acknowledge that and say, let's keep working at it. Let's see if we can't build on this. But to go from there to we're just tearing it up and hoping for the best by applying pressure and, maybe Iran will come out with its hands up when there's just no evidence that that was going to happen. It hasn't happened and it won't happen. That to me is irresponsible. And again, I think just the facts, the results of what has transpired speak for themselves.
And I suppose, the other question is related to it, kind of the other fallout from it. Ayatollah Khamenei had long said, don't trust the United States. He let Rouhani proceed, the relative moderates proceed. But are you concerned that the United States withdrawing from the agreement unilaterally has only emboldened the hardliners or kind of validated their position? And if that's the case, would you expect maybe hardliners kind of next year's election to gain more kind of purchase in Iranian politics? And then also directly, if there was a chance for any new negotiation or new agreement, whether under Trump or Biden, is it that much harder? And also will be that much harder now to get the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese to come back on board when we walked out before?
So look, it's clear that the hardliners are already on the march in Iran. They have made gains in the parliament. They are shaping the discourse in the country. They are likely to dominate next year's presidential election in Iran. Iran will have a presidential election a few years after, I hope Joe Biden is sworn in January of 2021. So we'll be right in the middle of their political season, and that will be meaningful. And Ronan, yes, the answer is trying to get back to a credible negotiation to produce a durable outcome that stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon for the long term is going to be made more complicated by the fact that the U.S. made a deal and then walked away from it, despite the fact that Iran was complying. That being said, the United States has leverage. We have cards to play ourselves, and if we play them smart and if we play them coolly, I do believe that we can secure an agreement from Iran that will satisfy our needs. So I don't think there should be a circumstance where we just go in and say, oh, we're sorry. I think we go in and say, this is the situation. We would like to get back to the table. We would like you to re-embrace the constraints in your program. We would like to reestablish the full parameters of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And then we'd like to talk about finding ways to ensure that we are extending those constraints so that we can have long-term comfort and assurance that Iran will never get a nuclear weapon. I think we can accomplish that if we play our cards right, and I think we can bring our allies and partners along with us. But it is, sort of diplomacy 101 that if you cut a deal and then you walk away, going back to the table comes with added complexity when you're trying to cut the next deal with the exact same both counterparty on the other side and fellow parties on the same side. So I do not at all underestimate the diplomatic task ahead, but it's a worthy task.
Maybe just another 2 or 3 questions before we kind of turn it over to the audience. Just maybe some of the bigger points. We won't be able to get to all of them. But Afghanistan, the longest war in American history and certainly one of the most complicated. This year, and starting last year, there's been news about discussions of possible peace talks with the Taliban. What are your perspectives on, if the Taliban are part of a political settlement or political, agreement in Afghanistan, what does that mean for the rest of the Afghani population and basic human rights within Afghanistan? And then kind of with the American perspective, if some agreement like that should be reached, do you think the United States should maintain a military presence in the years to come?
Well, look, this is why it's so important that the ultimate negotiations, the ones that will determine the success or failure of any peace deal in Afghanistan, are not between the U.S. and the Taliban or the West and the Taliban, but between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And those talks are set to begin. It's my genuine hope that they can produce a lasting peace accord, one that reflects and reinforces the rights of all Afghans, especially the rights of Afghan women, and that reflects and reinforces that the Taliban have to truly sever ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and truly cease operating as the armed group that it has been operating over the course of the past 2 decades. At the end of the day, my view is that we need to bring our troops home from Afghanistan, that Americans are rightly tired of this conflict, that we have reached a point where somebody who was born after we withdrew could now go enlist and serve in Afghanistan as the longest war in our country's history. But we also will need a counterterrorism plan. I'm not convinced that counterterrorism plan requires a long-term permanent presence in Afghanistan. I think there are ways to do it, to prevent another 9/11, to prevent safe havens that don't require that. But part of that will have to be ensuring that there are verifiable and credible assurances and commitments through the end of this peace process by the Taliban to truly sever ties with Al-Qaeda as we go forward.
And just related to that, do you think the Taliban would be realistic to expect them to kind of turn away from their typical tactics? And if, I suppose, regular American forces are withdrawn from Afghanistan, would you advocate, if there was a status of forces agreement, if the Afghan government would allow it, special forces or other, I suppose, military abilities for the U.S. to stay in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the days of the United States engaging in regular tempo of military operations in Afghanistan should be behind us. I think the idea that we would have a variety of different forms of counterterrorism capabilities in and around the region, to deal with potential threats that might emerge in Afghanistan, I think that can be worked out. It can be worked out with an Afghan government going forward. Can the Taliban actually get to a peace deal that allows for some lasting peace and stability in Afghanistan? Look, it's not going to be easy. By no means do I just sort of sit back and say, oh, sure, that'll happen and peace will bloom. We're talking about a very long-standing conflict with a quite vicious set of characters sitting on the other side of the table. But do I think there is a possibility that this can get on a path that is a significant improvement and a durable improvement over what we have seen for the past, more than 15 years? I think that is possible. It will require painstaking diplomatic work supporting the intra-Afghan negotiations from the outside. And it will require the United States continuing to make clear that we are going to retain the capabilities to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a safe haven for foreign terrorist groups going forward.
And so it's a turn, maybe before we get to the audience, for another potential threat. North Korea, failed, I suppose, negotiations and broken promises to them, from the Clinton administration to Bush 43 through your administration, Obama, again, and little luck under the Trump administration. In some ways, if the regime sees the maintaining of nuclear weapons as existential for its regime survival, and also if they view the idea of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula being required for any sort of deal, which would mean the United States would no longer have a kind of a nuclear shield for South Korea. In a lot of ways, do you think any sort of actual deal is possible with North Korea, or should we just work on basically the highest and best forms of containment?
I think we have to work on both a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. I think on the long-term strategy, we should not give up the goal of a denuclearized Korean peninsula and a nuclear-free North Korea. We should keep working towards that. I don't think we should just throw up our hands. In the short term, though, I think that the Trump strategy and the Hanoi summit of sort of all or nothing was the wrong strategy. We should be working to reduce proliferation in North Korea. They have added both nuclear devices and missiles since the Singapore and Hanoi summits. They're continuing to pile up their arsenal. And so we should be looking to place curbs on that with respect to intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched ballistic missiles, other forms of rocketry and missiles, and a reduction in their overall nuclear capability. I think we can work towards that stepwise in consultation and concert with our allies while looking for the long-term goal of stopping, eliminating North Korea's nuclear capability. And that, that requires both aggressive work now and a steadiness over time, that, and a willingness to stick with the strategy, not just kind of photo op summits and the like. And that's what we, what you could see from a Biden administration. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge, and you laid it out in your question, the Clinton administration couldn't stop North Korea from working on nuclear material. The Bush administration couldn't, the Obama administration couldn't, the Trump administration hasn't been able to. So we do have to come at this with real humility about what's possible, and not overpromise. But I do think that there is material progress that can be made, and a long-term goal of denuclearization should be maintained.
All right, just Richard asks, are there any low-hanging fruit, common ground issues we can find with China, as you mentioned, with regards to dealing with Russia?
I'm not sure with respect to dealing with Russia, honestly. It's something that it's an excellent question. That relationship, obviously, between the US, Russia, and China was, the object of enormous fascination for Cold War years. It was what drove Nixon's opening to China. And that three-way relationship remains a real factor in the geopolitical landscape today. But the fact is that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, at least on a shorter-term basis, share a common interest in undermining America's position and standing in international institutions, in undermining the appeal and allure of American democracy, in advancing a theory of multipolarity that makes the world safe for authoritarianism, and reduces the overall kind of global valuation of democracy, human rights, and freedom. And that alignment, I think, is one that gives pride of place to each other in their relationship vis-a-vis the United States, and makes it difficult for us to go to Beijing to try to do something on Russia, or to go to Moscow and try to do something on China. But again, as I was saying in North Korea, there's a short-term issue here and a long-term issue. Over the long term, Russia and China, there are many reasons to believe that they're not going to be joined at the hip, and that they're going to have plenty of friction across a very long border, where the countries are headed in very different directions economically and in other ways. And we should pay attention to that, attend to that over time. But I think in the near term, centering our strategy around trying to work one against the other, I think is less effective than dealing from a position of strength with each of them, and trying to recognize and blunt the strategy the two have developed together to try to undermine American interests, both in international institutions and more directly.
And just to be sure I addressed his question properly, with regards to low-hanging fruit, just for direct U.S.-China relations.
I see. I thought it. Okay.
I'm not certain myself. I mean, you did a great job answering. That's the fascinating. The triangle there of Russia, China, and U.S. is fascinating as well.
No. Yes, there is low-hanging fruit. Let's start with climate. The United States is 15% of the world's emissions. 85% are happening outside the U.S. That means that if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we're going to need effective, sustained diplomacy where the United States is helping lead the world in elevating the ambition of the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Paris Climate Agreement was built on the foundation of a bilateral deal between the US and China, China being by far the world's largest emitter. And with the US having said it's pulling out of Paris, China has felt it can do a lot more to export pollution through the Belt Road Initiative, and its investments in neighboring countries. And so we're going to have to hold China's feet to the fire, but frankly also engage in forms of cooperative diplomacy to try to get on the same page for how we together can help move the ball forward for the whole world on climate. That would be one issue. I think there are others too. China has a lot to answer for when it comes to COVID-19 and the ways in which it covered up the outbreak and kept the world in the dark on the nature of this virus. But the fact is that future pandemics are going to require effective cooperation and effective visibility And we would want China to be a part of that. So that's another issue on which we could work with them. And then just the third, I mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. Nuclear proliferation writ large is an issue on which the US and China have been able to find some common ground in the past, and where we should find a way to work together going forward. Look, there's a lot of issues on which we're going to disagree. There's going to be stiff and tough and hard-nosed competition, but there are also areas where it is in the United States' national interest to work with China, and we should do so.
And Jamil asked an interesting question. Under a Biden presidency, what would you expect with regards to international relations, particularly allies and friends? Will there be a reset, new beginning, or would it largely be carried over from Obama's administration where he left it?
I think reset, now I'm like kind of, reset is sort of no, we're not doing resets. I was there actually when Hillary Clinton gave the red reset button to the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who, by the way, is still in that position. He's quite a survivor. And she tried to put the word reset, or her team tried to put the word reset in Russian on it. And it ended up, I think, being the word overcharge, which maybe was more what was ultimately going to happen to the US-Russia relationship. So there may have been something prophetic in that. But the reason I resist reset in this context is not merely because it conjures the issue of the reset with respect to Russia, but also because it misses, I think, a fundamental thrust of what a Biden administration's policy would be, which is modernizing, moving forward these alliances, recognizing that the nature of security threats has changed, that corruption is now a national security threat coming from Russia, China, and other places. The climate is a national security threat, that cyber has evolved in ways that require a different approach for the alliance, both the NATO alliance and our allies in the Asia Pacific. That underlying technology questions, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, require deep alliance consultation and commitment. That trade and economics now have taken on a geopolitical cast to a greater extent than they have in decades past. So all of that will mean that, yes, we need to reinforce the foundations of these alliances, but we also need to modernize the agenda and the capabilities of our alliances as we look forward to deal both with great power competition and to deal with the transnational challenges we face, that I was discussing before, from global health to climate to nuclear proliferation.
All right, and just John Paul asks, and sometimes I might just paraphrase, see if I'm getting it correctly. As vice president, obviously it's still ultimately Obama's decision, but Biden abandoned our allies in Iraq without a status of forces agreement. If he was unwilling to defend our allies in Iraq, and perhaps I'm not sure if he means the Kurds, as well going forward, what will our allies in other places expect?
Well, I think unwilling to defend our allies in Iraq is a kind of flat mischaracterization of what actually happened. The Iraqis had a vote in this, and the Iraqi government chose not to have a status of forces agreement, decided that the Bush administration's status of forces agreement, which expired, would not be extended, which meant U.S. forces, U.S. troops were no longer welcome in Iraq. And so the U.S. ended up withdrawing, despite a considerable period of negotiation to try to secure that agreement at the time. Vice President Biden then helped build and helped lead a 65-nation coalition against ISIS. And, one of the things that the Trump administration did coming in was keep the key leader of that effort in the U.S. government in place and keep the strategy in place to continue what had been the major progress over the remaining months of the Obama-Biden administration to push back ISIS and to deny it territory and safe haven. And so, I was in the room when Vice President Biden got phone calls from people like Masoud Barzani, the leader of the Kurds, saying, we need support and assistance to push back against ISIS, and the United States delivered that. And Joe Biden delivered that. And so I think if you go talk to the Kurds or you talk to the Iraqis or others in the region, they will tell you that the vice president is a person who says what he means and means what he says. That's the kind of president he will be. That's very different from the way that President Trump has approached the issue, particularly with respect to the Kurds, where he cut a deal with Erdogan to kind of pull out and leave them to their own devices. And we all saw the images that came as a result of that. And ultimately, it was the abandonment of American bases that ended up having the Russians come in and raise the Russian flag over American bases, something none of us had seen in our lifetime. So I think there's a real contrast on this issue. And I feel quite confident that Vice President Biden, with his relationships and his credibility, could come in and effectively steward U.S. Strategy, not just in the Middle East, but around the world.
As you noticed in Iraq, the Bush administration wasn't able to get an extended status forces agreement. And the Obama administration wasn't as well. Some people might say Obama ultimately preferred to pull U.S. forces out of Iraq. But either way, do you think it's probably a fair assessment to say, without a major U.S. military presence in Iraq, that was how and why ISIS was able to grow so massively and exponentially?
I think the single biggest reason that ISIS was able to grow in the way they were was the Syrian civil war, was Raqqa, really. Now, their capacity to end up getting into Iraq was probably affected in some way by the absence of a U.S. military presence. But at the end of the day, the establishment of the caliphate with its headquarters on the Syrian side in Raqqa, I think, was very much about the outcome of the Syrian civil war. I also have to say, Donald Trump has just announced a reduction in U.S. troops from 5,200 to 3,000, or the Pentagon has announced it. I welcome the fact that U.S. troops are coming home. I think that's a good thing. And yet, ISIS conducted 100 attacks in August alone in the region. So a big part of the long-term strategy for the United States cannot be about permanent U.S. military presences there. It has to be about empowering local actors to be able to deal with terrorist threats effectively. And to me, having the primary lesson of the past be just more U.S. troops in the region is the wrong lesson. I think the right lesson is find ways to make sure that credible local forces have the capacity to deal with these problems on their own.
All right, and just for the sake of time, this will be our last question from the audience. Bernard asks, how has the balance of power changed as a result of COVID-19? Has anyone grown stronger? Has anyone grown weaker? What do you think its impacts have been upon basically the world stage, especially in terms of foreign policy?
I think it's too soon to tell, because the ripple effects of this are going to keep kind of crashing through until we're fully on the other side of it. And those ripple effects include the public health performance in various countries, where the U.S. has not exactly acquitted itself well, compared to its peers around the world, but also to the economic consequences, and in particular in the emerging world, where you're seeing the gathering storm of a debt crisis to go alongside the public health crisis and climate and migration crises as well. That's going to create new demands on support for the emerging world, and how the U.S. responds to that and how China responds to that, how Europe responds to that will say something about what ultimately happens with the balance of power down the road. In addition, China has been trying to take advantage of this by saying, hey, we got it under control and we're trying to help other people. On the other hand, there's a lot of countries around the world that have very serious, legitimate questions about China's culpability in all of this. And so their brand, their soft power may come in for a more durable hit over time as well. And the United States still has a chance of pulling up and out of this in a way where, not to borrow a phrase, but, if we build back better, if we actually use this crisis as an opportunity to reinforce our fundamental foundations across the economy and our democracy, our society, the United States this could be a big wake-up call for us. And so I think, scorekeeping on the balance of power today the situation's just too dynamic. A lot of how this will end up playing out is in our hands. It's in the choices we make.
And lastly, maybe just in conclusion, for people to get kind of overall idea of your perspectives and your outlook. Obviously, we've had a lot of great insights so far. The last few years, in a lot of ways, a lot of Americans and some of our allies have had concerns about the United States perhaps in different ways, stepping back from global leadership. What would your ideals be for kind of a new form or kind of resurgent U.S. foreign policy, and how the U.S. or if the U.S. should take a major role in global leadership?
Look, I said at the outset with respect to China, I think our number 1, 2, and 3 responsibility right now is to fix our foundations at home. But I don't see anything inconsistent with that and being robustly engaged in the world, and I think we have to be, because so many of the major challenges that face our country today, whether it's climate change, or it's public health, or it's terrorism, or it's technology, or it's economics, we are frankly all in the same boat with the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, we have to effectively deal with these challenges by rallying the world to solve them together. No one country can solve any of these on their own, and none of them, I think, can be effectively solved without the United States playing a critical role. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to be the global hegemon. It doesn't mean we're going to be the world's policeman. But what it does mean is that with humility, but with clarity and with consistency, we go out and say, we're prepared to step up and do our part, and we're going to ask others to do their part as well. That is a form of leadership I think the American people can embrace. That is a form of leadership that should get a bipartisan backing. And that is what I hope we can return to in the years ahead.
Well, again, I just wanted to thank everyone, all of our members and guests, and especially our 2 teachers and students for joining us today. And Jake Sullivan, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's an extremely busy time for you right now. We're delighted and honored to have you, and we would be delighted to host you hopefully at some point in person again in Houston. So thank you very much for your time, and I thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronan. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you all.